February 19, 1944. Lieutenant Ike Kepford tears across the South Pacific in his F4U Corsair. Navy procedure said that when his wingman's engine began smoking and forced him to break off, he should have stayed with him. Kepford paid little heed to doctrine. He had already been reprimanded for his attitude, kicked out of flight school, been caught dogfighting with U.S. Army aircraft during training, and the impulsive ace was eager for more kills. Beneath him, he spotted an irresistible mark, a lone Japanese seaplane. Unaware of the Corsair above, Kepford dove in, his 6 guns ripping into the unsuspecting aircraft and sending it down into the sea. But the seaplane was not alone. Looking up, his eyes widened at the sight of 20 Japanese Zero fighters swarming overhead. Most pilots would have panicked. Kepford welcomed the fight. As a member of Fighter Squadron 17, the notorious Jolly Rogers, he was ready to make the skull and crossbones on his tail mean something to the enemy. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Tommy Blackburn stood on the dock at Virginia's Norfolk Naval Air Station on New Year's Day 1943, with plenty of doubts. Just 2 months earlier, his first squadron command had ended in disaster off the coast of Morocco, and Blackburn himself had spent 3 agonizing days in a life raft after his damaged Wildcat was forced to ditch in heavy seas. Now the Navy had given him a second chance, and the fleet's most controversial fighter. The F4U Corsair was unlike anything naval aviation had seen, driven by roughly 2,000 horsepower from a Pratt & Whitney engine, and defined by an inverted gullwing that created a striking silhouette. It was faster and more powerful than any carrier fighter before it, but it was also a maintenance headache, plagued by hydraulic leaks, fuel system troubles, and landing gear that behaved unpredictably on carrier decks. Fighter Squadron 17, VF-17, would be only the second Navy squadron to receive the Corsair. Rather than complain about being guinea pigs for a problem aircraft, Blackburn was determined to unlock its potential. But the reputation problem extended beyond the plane. Oscar Ox, a pilot who had served with Blackburn as an instructor in Opelika, Florida, later recalled that the squadron was made up of a group of people who were, I guess you might say, misfits in other squadrons. They had clashed with their skippers or done something wrong, yet Tom would step in and say, "I can handle him." Where other commanders saw insubordination, Blackburn saw independent, aggressive spirits who might be able to master the unconventional fighter. The unit soon picked up the nickname Blackburn's Irregulars. One of the unruly young pilots Blackburn took under his wing was 24-year-old Lieutenant Ike Kepford, a former Northwestern University football player who had been washed out of civilian pilot training for going home at Christmas without permission. Instructors said he lacked the right attitude for a flyer. During VF-17's training at Norfolk, their reputation as reckless wildcards continued to grow. So eager to reach combat, they sometimes sharpened their skills by taking on aircraft from other branches of the U.S. military. On one occasion, Kepford is said to have engaged a P-51 Mustang from the Army Air Forces in a dramatic dogfight over the town of Norfolk. Largely because of antics like these, the squadron was hurriedly transferred from Norfolk to Moneo, North Carolina, where they completed their training. Blackburn wanted an insignia to suit both the Corsair's pirate nickname and his ragtag band of pilots. The choice was obvious. A skull and crossbones originally designed by pilot Harry Hall. That emblem birthed the name by which the squadron would become legendary, the Jolly Rogers. By the summer of 1943, VF-17 had accomplished what many thought impossible. They had tamed the Corsair. Months of intensive training had ironed out the fighter's most dangerous quirks, and Blackburn's pilots could land the bent-wing beast on a carrier deck as smoothly as any Hellcat. When USS Bunker Hill sailed from Norfolk for the Pacific in August, the Jolly Rogers were finally ready for combat and could hardly wait to get into action. Rear Admiral John Ballantyne, Chief of Staff to Commander Air Forces Pacific, later said, "They were so anxious to fight that sometimes I was almost afraid to let them take off from the ship for fear they'd start shooting at each other." But the Navy High Command had other plans. The Corsair's reputation for difficult carrier operations had spread throughout the fleet, creating a logistics nightmare for planners. While VF-17 had mastered their aircraft, many other squadrons still struggled with the temperamental fighter. Supply officers were fretting. Because carriers are cramped in complex places, and carrying spare parts, tools, and trained mechanics for 2 very different fighter types made maintenance planning much harder. Each model had unique engines, hydraulic components, and landing gear parts, and keeping enough inventory aboard to support both the Corsair and the Hellcat risked cluttering supply spaces and slowing repairs. Flight deck crews added to the pressure by pointing out that the Corsair demanded more room and skill to launch and recover its long takeoff. Run and higher touchdown speeds made deck operations slower and raised the chance of accidents in the crowded, pitching environment of a carrier deck. The simplest operational fix was to standardize on a single fighter type so that spare parts, training, and deck procedures could be unified. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat had already shown it was robust, easy for deck crews and pilots to manage, and effective in combat. so planners argued it would reduce risk and logistical strain compared with the temperamental Corsair. Even though the F-17 had spent months learning to handle the Corsair at sea and had solved many of the type's trickier behaviors, higher command decided that fleet-wide consistency outweighed the gains of keeping a single carrier with a mixed air group. As a result, Blackburn's squadron was ordered off USS Bunker Hill and reassigned to operate from land bases. For the pilots and maintainers who had poured sweat into making the Corsair carry, the decision was crushingly ironic. They had proven the type could work aboard ships. Yet institutional preference for uniformity and the demands of supply chains trumped their achievement. The men and their airplanes were rushed into the Pacific theater, the aircrews flown in first while the Corsairs, followed by sea, and they quickly discovered that shore-based flying was a different challenge entirely. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal was a steel-planked strip packed with activity and surrounded by swamp and jungle. Crews who had trained for neat carrier decks now faced slogging through mud, fighting swarms of mosquitoes, and keeping aircraft running with limited shop facilities. When the unit moved to Andonga on New Georgia, the conditions grew harsher. Coral runways that kicked up abrasive dust, minimal shelter, and medical help far away made every mission a test of endurance as well as flying skill. Despite the primitive conditions, the mechanics and pilots adapted fast. Ship deliveries of the Corsairs and intensive ground maintenance allowed the squadron to have its bent wing fighters ready to fly in a matter of days, and their distinctive skull and crossbones nose art helped bind the unit together as a fighting team. The arrival coincided with the Bougainville operation, which required maximum fighter coverage to protect troop transports and landing ships. Blackburn's men were assigned to high cover, a role that kept them above the assault forces where they could engage incoming enemy formations before bombs or dive bombers reached the vulnerable transports. When the Japanese responded, they did so in force. Formations of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, escorted by Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, launched from bases like Rabaul and pressed aggressively to smash the invasion fleet. The Corsairs' advantages: higher top speed, heavier armament, and a stable firing platform paired with Blackburn's emphasis on disciplined tactics and coordinated attack patterns, allowed VF-17 to engage the attackers effectively. Rather than trying to trade tight turning maneuvers with the more agile Zero, Blackburn's pilots exploited speed and firepower, using diving attacks and well-drilled gunnery passes to break up bomber formations and pick off escorts. Asterisk, the result of that combat debut was decisive. VF-17 shot down several enemy aircraft, including 2 credited to Blackburn, without suffering any squadron losses and successfully preventing any Japanese bombs from striking the invasion shipping. Beyond the immediate tactical success, the engagement validated both the squadron's intensive training and the Corsairs' combat worthiness in the harsh conditions of Pacific Island warfare, proving that with skilled crews and careful tactics, the fighter could be a potent asset even when operating from primitive land bases rather than carriers. They showed no sign of fading after their dramatic debut on November 1st and immediately began flying daily strikes against the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. The sprawling enemy complex on New Britain, with 4 airfields and roughly 100,000 troops, had become the Allies' primary objective in the campaign to neutralize Japanese air power in the region. Each morning brought fresh briefings, new escort duties, and another chance for the Jolly Rogers to prove themselves. Their victory total steadily climbed. But the Japanese were not conceding. Isoli pilots out of Rabaul ranked among the Imperial Navy's best and grew increasingly aggressive as Allied pressure mounted. On November 8, exactly 1 week after VF-17's first sortie, Executive Officer Roger Hedrick led a flight of 8 Corsairs on what should have been a routine patrol when radar picked up a massive Japanese formation climbing out of Rabaul. 39 enemy fighters, the largest force the squadron had yet faced. Then, misfortune hit. 2 of Hedrick's Corsairs developed mechanical troubles and had to peel away, leaving only 6 skull and crossbones fighters to face overwhelming numbers. At nearly 7-1, the odds looked impossible, but Hedrick was no ordinary leader. With more than 200 hours of fighter time before his first combat mission, he brought a level of tactical savvy many other squadrons lacked. As the Japanese formation closed, he arranged his remaining planes for a high-speed slashing attack, exploiting the F4U's superior diving speed to blunt the enemy's numerical advantage. The fight was quick and brutal. Hedrick's 6 Corsairs sliced into the Japanese stream, shooting down 3 fighters and damaging 4 more before withdrawing to safety. Not a single American plane was lost, and the battered enemy group fell back toward Rabaul. Having learned that this new Navy squadron could fight with precise, disciplined tactics even when hopelessly outnumbered, 3 days later, on November 11, VF-17 scrambled over Empress Augusta Bay to intercept another large strike coming from Rabaul. Leading the American response in Corsair 29 was Ike Kepford, who was about to answer his critics in spectacular fashion. As VF-17 climbed into the melee of more than 100 warplanes, Kepford found himself ideally placed to strike a formation of dive bombers heading for the task. Force below. What followed was a showcase of pilot instinct and nerve. Amid the swirling chaos above the Solomon Sea, Kepford methodically picked off for enemy aircraft 3 Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers and a Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo plane his heavy guns, turning them into burning wreckage that plunged into the sea. A contemporary Navy account reported that after claiming those 4 victories in a single mission, Kepford landed grinning like a kid with his first bicycle. Several of Kepford's squadron mates also scored that day. By the end of the massive engagement, F-17 claimed 18 enemy aircraft destroyed and another 6 damaged. They returned with only 3 planes hit and 1 pilot wounded, having stood up to overwhelming odds and safeguarded the American ships from what might have been a devastating strike. Hedrick and Kepford quickly emerged as the squadron's leading aces. Their different approaches, one measured and methodical, the other bold and improvisational, came to embody the Jolly Rogers. Adaptability. They were not the only men piling up victories. Squadron Commander Tommy Blackburn continued to lead from the front, adding enemy aircraft to his tally, while Ox Chenoweth and Lieutenant Robert Cole also built impressive records, and newcomers like Lieutenant Daniel Cunningham proved Blackburn's knack for spotting talent. VF-17's edge lay in more than hardware or individual bravery. It was shaped by Blackburn's leadership. He could be strict. He did not hesitate to reprimand those who underperformed, and he removed pilots he judged unwilling. At the same time, he was always experimenting to make the unit more effective. Tactics had to be reshaped to fit the Corsairs' character. Where other units used formation patterns designed for lighter fighters, Blackburn adapted the formation to suit the F4U's larger, heavier, and faster profile, creating a combat scheme that played to the Corsairs' strengths while covering its vulnerabilities. Blackburn's innovations went beyond aerial maneuvers. When bomber formations were forced back by bad weather and left fighters with nothing to escort, most commanders would call off the mission. Blackburn chose a different path, equipping his Corsairs with 500-pound bombs so they could carry out independent strike missions. If their bombers could not reach the target, they didn't slow down after their dramatic debut on November 1st. Instead, they began flying daily strikes against the Japanese fortress at Rabaul, the sprawling New Britain complex with 4 airfields and roughly 100,000 troops that had become the Allies' primary target for neutralizing enemy air power in the region. Each morning brought new briefings, fresh escort assignments, and more chances for the Jolly Rogers to prove themselves. Their victory tally climbed steadily, but the opposition from Rabaul was fierce. Pilots from that hub were among the Imperial Navy's best and grew more aggressive as Allied pressure increased. On November 8, exactly a week after VF-17's first sortie, Executive Officer Roger Hedrick led 8 Corsairs on what should have been a routine patrol when radar reported a massive enemy force climbing out of Rabaul, 39 fighters, the largest concentration the squadron had yet faced. Trouble came quickly. Mechanical problems forced 2 Corsairs to peel off, leaving only 6 skull and crossbones planes to confront overwhelming numbers. At nearly 7-1, the odds seemed hopeless. Hedrick, however, was no ordinary leader. With more than 200 hours of fighter time before his first combat mission, he brought tactical polish most units lacked. As the enemy closed, he arranged his remaining ships for a high-speed slashing attack, using the F4U's superior diving speed to blunt the numerical disadvantage. The fight was short and brutal. Hedrick's 6 Corsairs struck the Japanese formation, shooting down 3 fighters and damaging 4 more before withdrawing unharmed. Not a single American aircraft was lost, and the battered enemy force pulled back toward Rabaul, having learned that this new Navy squadron could fight with discipline even when outnumbered. 3 days later, on November 11th, the F-17 launched over Empress Augusta Bay to intercept another large strike from Rabaul. Leading the American response in Corsair 29 was Ike Kepford, who was about to silence many doubters. As VF-17 climbed into the chaos of more than 100 warplanes, Kepford found himself perfectly positioned to strike a formation of dive bombers heading for the task. Force below. What followed was a display of raw pilot instinct. In the swirling melee over the Solomon Sea, Kepford methodically picked off for enemy aircraft 3 Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers and 1 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo plane is .50 caliber, guns turning them into burning wreckage that tumbled into the ocean. A contemporary Navy account said that after claiming those 4 kills in one mission, Kepford landed grinning like a kid with his first bicycle. Several squadron mates scored that day as well, when the smoke-cleared VF-17 claimed 18 enemy planes destroyed and 6 more damaged. The unit returned with only 3 aircraft hit and 1 pilot wounded. Having stood between the enemy and what might have been a devastating strike on the American ships, Hedrick and Kepford quickly emerged as the squadron's leading aces. Their different approaches, one measured and methodical, the other bold and improvisational, came to symbolize the Jolly Rogers' versatility. Others, including Commander Tommy Blackburn, Ox Chenoweth, Lieutenant Robert Cole, and newcomers like Lieutenant Daniel Cunningham, were also piling up impressive records. VF-17's Success flowed from more than just talented pilots or a capable airplane. It was shaped by Blackburn's style of command. He could be strict, he reprimanded underperformers, and he didn't hesitate to remove anyone he judged unwilling to meet the unit's standards. But he was always experimenting to make the squadron more effective. Tactics were reshaped to suit the Corsairs' nature. Instead of relying on formation patterns developed for lighter fighters, Blackburn adapted his schemes to the F4U's larger, heavier, and faster profile, creating combat arrangements that amplified its strengths and masked its weaknesses. Blackburn's innovations went beyond dogfighting. When weather or other factors forced bomber formations back and left fighters with nothing to escort, most commanders would abort. Blackburn equipped his Corsairs with 500-pound bombs, so his pilots could switch to strike roles and still make the mission count. At a time when true fighter bombers were uncommon in the U.S. Navy, VF-17 began attacking shipping in Simpson Harbor with onboard ordnance before breaking off to engage enemy fighters, ensuring that every sortie delivered value, no matter what the weather or the bombers. Fortunes. Blackburn also knew morale mattered. Life ashore in the South Pacific was often miserably intense, heat and humidity, primitive quarters, poor food, disease-carrying insects, and minimal sanitation made daily existence a trial, and low spirits would blunt combat effectiveness. On a supply run, Blackburn and his maintenance officer discovered a small boost to morale. By loading only a third of the Corsairs' ammunition, they found room in the wing ammo trays for a few bottles of beer. Chilled at altitude, within hours, the squadron and neighboring Marines were sharing cold beer and a rare moment of relief. Years later, Ox Chenoweth summed up Blackburn's value in battle. When the shooting began, Blackburn was the man you wanted at your back. By the end of January 1944, under Blackburn's leadership, VF-17 had established itself as one of the Navy's most effective fighter squadrons. On February 19th, the Jolly Rogers launched what should have been a routine escort mission. Kepford led a division providing high cover for TBF Avengers striking near Cape St. George when his wingman's engine began to fail. Standard doctrine was clear: never leave a wingman alone over hostile territory. But Kepford spotted a lone Japanese seaplane skimming the water and made a choice. After watching his partner turn for home, he rolled into a diving attack, his .50 caliber guns ripping the seaplane apart in a single devastating burst that sent it into the sea and added to his tally. Triumph turned to peril almost instantly. From 16,000 feet, a huge enemy force dove out of the clouds. At least 20 fighters. 4 peeled off to chase Kepford while the remainder continued toward the American bombers. Frantic radio traffic crackled through the static as he called, "Skipper, Skipper, this is Ike. 3 have me boxed. I'm headed north." Low on fuel, deep in hostile airspace, Kepford was forced into a desperate running fight across miles of ocean, using every evasive move he knew and even tapping the Corsairs' experimental water injection system to squeeze extra speed out of the aircraft. Back at Bougainville, the squadron waited in tense silence for hours until, as the sun was setting, the sound of a familiar engine announced Corsair 29's return. Kepford climbed from the cockpit and raised 3 fingers. 3 more enemy fighters had been claimed, and he had survived. By May 1944, VF-17's combat tour was winding down with astonishing statistics. In just 76 days of operations, Blackburn's men had flown 8,557 combat hours, scored 154 confirmed victories plus 75 probables, and lost only 19 Corsairs, an extraordinary roughly 8-to-1 kill-to-loss ratio, unmatched by any other Navy squadron. Even more remarkable, not one bomber escorted by VF-17 was shot down during those months of daily attacks over the most heavily defended targets in the Pacific. The squadron provided an almost impenetrable shield for the strike aircraft it protected. The unit produced 13 aces, pilots with 5 or more confirmed kills, more than any other naval squadron. With 16 confirmed victories, Ike Kepford emerged not only as VF-17's leading ace, but as the top scorer in the U.S. Navy. Roger Hedrick followed with 12, and Tommy Blackburn with 11. While nearly every squadron member claimed at least one enemy aircraft, the transformation was complete. The misfits and troublemakers other commanders had trouble handling had become the Navy's most successful fighter squadron. The Corsair, once written off for carrier work, proved to be the deadliest fighter in the Pacific in skilled hands and earned ominous nicknames like Whistling Death. On May 10, 1944, VF-17 flew its final mission from the Solomon Islands. As the last Corsairs rolled to a stop on the jungle strip, ground crews began packing the planes for shipment back to the United States. The original Jolly Rogers were going home, though many of the men would continue fighting elsewhere. Roger Hedrick took command of the newly formed VF-84 and was joined by several former Blackburn irregulars, including Ike Kepford. In an ironic twist, that new squadron was assigned to USS Bunker Hill, the carrier that had rejected VF-17 less than a year earlier. VF-84 joined Task Force 58 for the final push across the Central Pacific, taking part in amphibious operations, raids on the Japanese home islands, and the historic sinking of the battleship Yamato. By war's end, that unit added another 92 victories to its record. Blackburn's wartime achievements earned him the Navy Cross and a promotion to Washington to help shape fleet fighter requirements, though he couldn't stay away from combat entirely and later rode aboard 3rd Fleet units as an observer. He won a Senior Commander Group 74 aboard the new carrier, USS Midway, but the atomic bombs in August 1945 brought that assignment to an abrupt, unfinished end. VF-17 didn't vanish after the war. It was redesignated VF-5B in November 1946 and then VF-61 in July 1948, keeping the skull and crossbones until April 15, 1959, when VF-61 was disestablished. The Jolly Roger's legacy might have ended, but in 1960, the commanding officer of VF-8 for originally formed 5 years earlier as the Vagabonds and separate from the World War II unit tasked to adopt the Jolly Roger's name and insignia. On April 1, 1960, VF-8 officially became the new Jolly Rogers. That squadron carried the pirate tradition through the Cold War, flying jets from FJ-3 Furies to F-14 Tomcat. After VF-84 was disbanded in 1995, VF-103, once the Slugger, sought and received permission to take up the skull and crossbones, ensuring the symbol survived. More than 80 years after Blackburn picked that pirate emblem for his band of misfits, the white skull on black remains one of military aviation's most enduring symbols. Modern Jolly Rogers flying FA-18 Super Hornets from Naval Air Station Oceana have carried the tradition into recent conflicts, returning from strikes over Iraq and Syria with bomb silhouettes painted on their FUS-ELAG. Is a visible link back to Blackburn's men that would surely have made him proud. On the 70th anniversary of the original VF-17's founding in 2013, VF-2103 refreshed its insignia to echo Blackburn's original patches and colors. From the steaming jungles of New Georgia to the flight decks of nuclear carriers, the skull and crossbones endures. Perhaps Blackburn's truest legacy was not merely building a winning squadron, but forging a legend that refuses to fade.